Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content. The Trump administration's request to the U.S. Supreme Court to halt all supplemental nutrition assistance programs, SNAP payments, is more than a budgetary move. It's a philosophical one, a moral statement about who deserves help and who doesn't. On the surface, the administration frames its argument as one of fiscal responsibility, arguing that the program has expanded beyond its original scope. But beneath the rhetoric lies something deeper, a redefinition of the American state as a disciplinarian rather than a protector. SNAP, once known as food stamps, is more than just a welfare program. It's a cornerstone of America's modern social contract. It ensures that tens of millions of low-income families can eat even when the market fails to meet their needs. In essence, it's the final line between poverty and starvation. Asking the nation's highest court to suspend this lifeline is not to treat hunger as a problem to be solved, but as a lesson to be taught. In this moral calculus, scarcity becomes a virtue. The poor are taught that their suffering is evidence of moral weakness, and the state's refusal to help is seen as a form of tough love. This is not new, of course. The American right has long viewed welfare as a moral hazard. Since Ronald Reagan, conservative politics has equated support with dependency, replacing empathy with suspicion. Trump's move to cut SNAP is a continuation and radicalization of that legacy. His administration has turned fiscal austerity into a morality play, the idea that cutting aid is not cruelty but redress. It is this ideological logic that celebrates tax cuts for the wealthy while condemning food aid as wasteful. In this worldview, inequality is not a failure of policy. It is evidence that the system is working as intended. Yet there is a deeper paradox. Trump's populism claims to represent forgotten Americans, working-class citizens left behind by globalization. Many of those citizens are SNAP recipients or live in federally assisted communities. By targeting SNAP, the administration is not targeting an abstract welfare state, but the very people it claims to protect. Punitive politics masquerading as empowerment politics. The legal move to the Supreme Court only exacerbates this contradiction. A program designed to feed the hungry becomes the subject of constitutional litigation, reducing hunger to a technical dispute over executive power. What should have been a matter of compassion has been reframed as a matter of law. It is a profound symptom of moral fatigue in governance, a democracy that can argue for the rights of the poor but not for their hunger. In a country of immense wealth where corporations receive subsidies larger than the entire SNAP budget, the effort to block food assistance is not about money, it is about messaging. It signals to the powerful that the state is still on their side and to the vulnerable that they are alone. Justice requires a society to design its institutions as if it does not care about status or wealth. Trump's America has turned that principle on its head. It designs policy as if empathy is a burden and indifference is a virtue. The SNAP case, then, is not just a legal battle, it is a test of America's moral character. A nation that can debate whether the poor deserve to eat is on the brink not of bankruptcy but of conscience. The Trump administration's cuts to SNAP payments cannot be understood without considering the larger ideological project that has dominated American economic policy for decades, the triumph of market fundamentalism over moral economics. In this worldview, poverty is not a product of social structure, but of individual failure. We are taught that markets are not only efficient, they are fair. To interfere with their outcomes through redistribution is to challenge the natural order. Trump's challenge to SNAP is therefore not simply a fiscal measure. It is the logical expression of a political creed that sees wealth as virtue and need as weakness. the roots of this are deep. Since the 1,980 seconds under the revolution of Ronald Reagan, the United States has steadily dismantled the social contract that once bound capitalism to conscience. Social programs, unions, and public investment, pillars of the shared prosperity built after the Great Recession, were transformed into impediments to growth. The welfare queen myth became the moral fulcrum for economic decline, turning complex social realities into caricatures of laziness and fraud. Each decade since, that logic has been pushed further, narrowing the moral vocabulary of government to a single word: efficiency. Ironically, Trump inherited this orthodoxy even as he criticized it. His populism was marketed as a rebellion against elites, but his policies reinforced their dominance. His rhetoric spoke of working class pride, but his budget rewarded wealth. In the case of SNAP, the contradiction became clear. He denounced the economic system while fully embracing its ideology. His attack on food assistance is framed as liberation, freeing the poor from dependence. But it is, in fact, submission to a market that demands discipline but not dignity. This ideological reversal has devastating moral consequences. When social welfare is stigmatized, inequality is no longer a failure of governance, but a symbol of moral order. The poor are no longer citizens worthy of protection, but examples to teach others. Hunger becomes pedagogy. The message is clear: the state exists not to protect the vulnerable, but to reward those strong enough to survive without the state. Such logic does not reform society, it dehumanizes it. Yet behind this cruelty lies insecurity. The neoliberal order that Trump both inherited and exploited is collapsing under the weight of its contradictions. Productivity is rising while wages are stagnant. Corporations are thriving while public trust is collapsing. The very voters attracted by Trump's challenge are victims of the very markets his policies worship. The system that promised freedom has delivered uncertainty, and so politicians distract the public with morality, plays cutting food aid while subsidizing billionaires. The erosion of the social contract is therefore not an accident. It is a strategy. By replacing solidarity with suspicion, elites have turned the social problem into a moral one. Not why inequality exists, but who deserves help. The collective we is fragmented into a competition of virtues, a hierarchy of values. From a political economic perspective, this marks the collapse of the principle of reciprocity, the understanding that a nation's wealth is shared, its burdens are collective. The SNAP affair exposes this deterioration with brutal clarity. A society that feeds the market while starving its people is inefficient. It is broken. Ultimately, the attack on SNAP is not about food stamps. It is about philosophy. It is the final act of a 40-year experiment in economic Darwinism. The belief that compassion distorts markets and that suffering purifies the soul. What has collapsed here is not just welfare policy, but moral imagination, the ability to see other people's hunger as our own. And once that vision is lost, no economy, no matter how wealthy, can call itself civilized. When the Trump administration asked the Supreme Court to halt all SNAP payments, it was not just a legal demand, it was a demonstration of how deeply institutionalized America's political and moral crises have become. What should have been a matter of social morality, how should a wealthy nation treat its poor, was reframed as a technical debate about executive authority and administrative law. The hunger of millions is now debated not in Congress or the public, but in the dry language of litigation. This shift from moral considerations to judicial arbitration shows the fragility of democracy when compassion is consigned to the courts. Ultimately, the attack on SNAP is not about food stamps. It is about philosophy. It is the final act of a 40-year experiment in economic Darwinism. The belief that compassion distorts markets and that suffering purifies the soul. What has collapsed here is not just welfare policy, but moral imagination, the ability to see other people's hunger as our own. And once that vision is lost, no economy, no matter how wealthy, can call itself civilized. When the Trump administration asked the Supreme Court to halt all SNAP payments, it was not just a legal demand, it was a demonstration of how deeply institutionalized America's political and moral crises have become. What should have been a matter of social morality, how should a wealthy nation treat its poor, was reframed as a technical debate about executive authority and administrative law. The hunger of millions is now debated not in Congress or the public, but in the dry language of litigation. This shift from moral considerations to judicial arbitration shows the fragility of democracy when compassion is consigned to the courts. The United States has long relied on the judicial system to address what politics refuses to confront. Civil rights, reproductive rights, environmental regulation all have filtered through the courts, where moral issues are recast as constitutional puzzles. In the case of SNAP, this dynamic reaches its most brutal level. The Supreme Court, largely composed of justices shaped by the conservative legal movement, is being asked to determine whether the state should continue to feed its citizens. The very question of whether hunger is a legal or humanitarian issue signals a moral collapse in governance. Trump's turn to the judiciary reflects a broader trend, the weaponization of the courts to enforce ideology. Over the past decades, conservative legal networks funded by corporate interests and sustained by partisan media have turned the federal courts into guardians of economic orthodoxy. Judicial restraint, once a principle of humility, has become a mechanism of control. Courts now decide not just what the law permits, but what society should accept. The SNAP case thus joins a growing list of decisions that reshape social policy through legal minimalism, healthcare, labor rights, climate regulation. Each decision narrows the moral scope of governance, reducing public compassion to procedural austerity. At issue here is not just the fate of a food program, but the meaning of justice itself. When courts rule on hunger, they rule with a logic that excludes empathy. Legal reasoning demands neutrality, abstraction, distance, virtues in theory, but vices when applied to the politics of survival. A judge can weigh evidence and precedent, but cannot weigh the cries of hungry stomachs. The result is a system of indifferent rule where suffering becomes invisible under the rhetoric of constitutional balance. This institutional disconnect is eroding democracy from within. The Supreme Court, once a symbol of moral conscience, now risks becoming a tool of economic hierarchy. Its authority rests on legitimacy, the belief that the law serves justice, but when its decisions consistently favor the powerful at the expense of the powerless, legitimacy weakens. People begin to see the court not as an arbiter of fairness, but as an accomplice. Trust erodes, cynicism deepens, and the rule of law itself begins to feel hollow. In the Trump era, this erosion has accelerated. Legal challenges to social programs like SNAP are not just acts of governance, they are markers of identity. They told his supporters that the strong still rule, that real America rewards toughness, not gentleness. But by turning the Supreme Court into an ideological theater, the administration blurred the line between law and morality beyond recognition. The long-term effect was structural paralysis. Every moral issue, hunger, housing, healthcare, was relegated to the courts, where compassion was slowly strangled in the language of procedure. What emerged was not a democracy, but a brutal technocracy, government by litigation, where empathy was unconstitutional. In this sense, the SNAP case was more than an economic dispute. It was a constitutional parable. It shows a republic losing its moral compass, not through revolution, but through habit. When protecting the hungry, becomes a matter of paperwork, and the judiciary becomes the final guardian of injustice. This is the essence of Trump's populism and the broader populist trend sweeping Western democracies. It does not dismantle the elite system, it rebrands it. It replaces technocratic indifference with moral aggression, giving the disaffected a sense of participation in the punishment of others. The system remains unequal, but it feels righteous. In this way, the SNAP controversy becomes a kind of parable for American politics in the 21st century. It reveals not a clash of policies, but a collapse of empathy, a society that can no longer agree on what decency demands. The politics of hunger has become the politics of humiliation, and the class war of our time is waged not over resources, but over the right to feel morally superior. For Jeffrey Sachs, this is not only a political failure, but a spiritual one. A democracy cannot endure when it teaches its people to despise the weak. To govern through resentment is to feed the hunger of the human heart with bitterness, and that more than poverty itself is what threatens to undo the republic. Trump understood this dynamic intuitively. His political genius was not policy design, but emotional choreography. By targeting SNAP, he signaled to his base that he would punish the undeserving, that he would restore an imagined moral hierarchy where virtue belonged to the self-reliant and shame to the dependent. In doing so, he inverted the very idea of compassion. Helping the poor became weakness, confronting them strength. This inversion became central to his populism, a politics that thrives not on solving inequality, but on narrating it. The deeper tragedy is that many of those who cheer such measures are themselves victims of the same structural neglect. The populist paradox is cruel movements fueled by economic despair often end up supporting policies that deepen it. The white working class, devastated by wage stagnation and deindustrialization, finds emotional catharsis in moralizing poverty, condemning the urban poor as parasites, even while depending on similar forms of assistance. Trump's rhetoric feeds this cycle by transforming solidarity into resentment. He offers belonging, not through shared prosperity, but through shared scorn. The attempt by the Trump administration to halt SNAP payments when viewed through the lens of history is not merely a domestic controversy, it is a moral reckoning for the United States and a warning to the world. For 2 centuries, America's claim to leadership has rested not only on power but on promise, the promise that democracy guided by moral purpose could deliver dignity to its people. When a nation debates whether to feed its poor, that promise begins to collapse from within. At its heart, the SNAP case is not about food or fiscal prudence. It is about the soul of governance. A government that can subsidize billion-dollar corporations while litigating against hunger betrays not incompetence, but conviction, the belief that compassion is optional. In the Trump era, this belief hardened into ideology, the celebration of cruelty as authenticity, austerity as virtue. It was not enough to neglect the poor. One had to scorn them. That contempt, expressed through policy, rhetoric, and legal warfare, has eroded the moral foundations upon which America built its legitimacy, both at home and abroad. This moral corrosion carries global significance. For decades, Washington preached human rights, democracy, and freedom as universal values, yet the credibility of that message depends on example. When the richest nation on earth argues before its Supreme Court about whether its citizens should eat, it sends a signal to the world that America's moral compass has tilted toward hypocrisy. Nations in the global South, long lectured by Washington on governance and human dignity, now observe an empire that can no longer care for its own U.S. Power remains vast, but its moral authority, the soft power that once inspired, diminishes with every act of sanctioned indifference. Domestically, the erosion of compassion marks the end of what once made American democracy resilient, its capacity for empathy. The New Deal, the civil rights movement, the Great Society, all emerged from a moral intuition that prosperity without justice is hollow. But that intuition has been drowned by decades of neoliberal orthodoxy and partisan rage. The market has replaced the community. Performance has replaced principle. SNAP, the simplest expression of collective responsibility, becomes an ideological battlefield precisely because it reminds America of what it has forgotten, that civilization begins with the refusal to let others starve. Philosophically, this is the tragedy of modern America. It mistakes freedom for detachment. It celebrates the sovereignty of the individual while abandoning the interdependence that sustains society. In the pursuit of greatness, it has neglected goodness. Trump did not invent this crisis. He merely revealed it, stripping away the polite veneers of a system that long valued profit over people. The long-term consequence of this moral decay extends far beyond welfare policy. A society that normalizes indifference at home cannot inspire solidarity abroad. A nation that treats hunger as a budget line will treat war as an investment. The loss of compassion is not just a domestic weakness, it is a geopolitical liability. Empires do not collapse only from external enemies. They implode when they lose faith in their own humanity. As Professor Jeffrey Sachs might conclude, a just society is not measured by the wealth of its markets, but by the mercy of its institutions. America now faces a choice that transcends ideology: to continue the politics of punishment or to rediscover the moral architecture of empathy. If it fails to choose wisely, its decline will not come through conquest, but through moral exhaustion, a slow starvation of the soul that no court, no president, and no economy can reverse.